Hello students, this is the lesson video for lesson 2.15 and we'll be going over the next macromolecule, which is lipids. So here's a general overview of what we'll be going over today. Again, we'll be going over the macromolecule lipids. We'll be looking at different characteristics of lipids, mainly that it's hydrophobic, that it hates water or is afraid of water. We're going to go over how lipids are made up of both hydrogen and carbon mainly, and then we'll go over different examples of lipids like fats, oils, phospholipids, steroids, and waxes. So the goals for today's lesson is that you'll be able to recognize different types of lipids, again, fats, oils, phospholipids, steroids, as well as waxes. You'll be able to understand the role that lipids play in living organisms and that they are used for energy storage, they are different types of chemical messengers, and they're a really important component of membrane structure in cells. You'll also be able to understand how phospholipids form a boundary between the inside and outside of the cell, which means that it makes up the cell membrane. And like the other lessons in this unit, you'll be able to describe the role of carbohydrates, proteins, lipids, nucleic acids, and water in living things. But obviously today we'll be focusing on lipids. Okay, so lipids are organic molecules that do not mix with water to form solution. Remember, organic means that it's important for life and also that it's made up of carbon. So lipids fall into that category of organic molecules. One defining characteristic of lipids is that they do not mix with water to form solutions. And you probably know this already because if you were to mix oil with water, most of you guys know that they would not mix with one another but would sit in layers, right? So lipids do not mix with water to form solutions. Okay, so an example is you see this loon right here. This loon has a special unique ability that it doesn't absorb water, but rather water just runs off of its feathers. So why exactly does that happen? So loons produce an organic molecule called oil, which is a type of lipid, in a special gland near the base of their tail, so in the back. They use their beak to extract or to take out this oil from the gland and work it through their feathers, which gives it this waterproof coating. So because it's waterproof and it has this oil over it, water doesn't absorb into the feathers but rather just runs off, just as if you were wearing a waterproof jacket in the rain. The oil that waterproofs a loon's feather is one example of a lipid, a type of organic molecule that generally repels water. Lipids are hydrocarbons, which basically means that they're made up of both hydrogen as well as carbon. Okay, so again, the defining feature of lipids is that they are hydrophobic and they're also nonpolar. So a typical lipid consists of a long chain of carbon atoms. So you can see here, all these C's are carbons. So you see a long chain of them, and they're flanked by hydrogen atoms. And so you see there are kind of like hydrogen atoms coming out from the sides. Okay, that's what it means by flanked by hydrogen atoms. Sometimes at the end of the chain, there might be something other than carbon and hydrogen. So you see some oxygen, and in this case, there's a sodium atom as well. Okay, so the oil on a loon's feather is hydrophobic, or it means water avoiding. I'm sure you guys know the word phobia, which means fear, right? So fats and lipids have a fear of water, which means that they don't mix well together. The oil's molecular structure gives it that property because this whole chain right here, it does not have any charge. And if you remember, the water molecule is actually slightly charged, right? We have a slight positive charge on the hydrogens, and then a slight negative charge on the oxygen. Because water is charged, it likes to be next to things that are charged as well. However, because fats mainly have a long chain that has a neutral charge, they are not attracted to one another. Okay, so this portion, because it has an equal distribution of charges, because it is neutral, we call it non-polar. Whereas for water, we call water polar because it has those different charges. So these electrically neutral tails are not attracted to the polar molecules like water, which have a slightly negative and slightly positive side, which we saw right here. But as you suspect, we have a polar head. There is a polar head of the lipid. You see right here, there is a charge at the head of the lipid. And this head can be attracted to the water molecules. So this portion wouldn't be, but this smaller portion can be. The properties of polarity and non-polarity really play a role in how lipids function in the body. So we'll be looking at how the polar head and the non-polar tail interact in a cell. Okay, so some examples of lipids are fats and oils. And the thing that fats and oils have in common is that they are energy storage lipids. Okay, so we can store energy in the form of lipids with fats and oils. Okay, so this is a tiny bird right here that undergoes an incredible transformation every fall before it migrates. So basically, it eats enough food to double its body weight in just a few weeks. All of that additional weight is stored as fat. So it's going to rely on those fat reserves as fuel so that when it flies, it'll be able to break down the fat for energy. And the reason why is because this blackpoll warbler is actually going to take a long journey, a distance of nearly 4,000 kilometers, and it's going to take at least 90 hours. So it typically does not stop, and so it needs a way to replenish its energy, and it does that by breaking down its stored fat. Okay, so you might be asking the question, why would this bird store all that energy as fat instead of carbohydrates like glycogen, which we learned in the previous lesson? So the reason why this is because per unit volume, fat is actually lighter than carbohydrates. So it's going to be easier for this bird to carry the fat rather than glycogen. And also, in the same amount of volume, fat actually has twice as much chemical energy stored in its bonds as the same volume of carbohydrates. So it makes it a lot more efficient way to store energy. It has more chemical bonds that can be broken down for energy, and it's lighter. So it really maximizes its energy storage potential. All this fat is converted to glucose as part of the bird's metabolism eventually, so it'll go from fat to glucose, and then we'll use that to make ATP. Okay, but again, storing it as fat initially is the best way in order to be efficient in this case. So triglycerides. So fats and oils store energy in carbon-hydrogen bonds. So they store it in its chemical bonds. Fats and oils, for example, butter, lard, and olive oil, are all types of lipids called triglycerides. So triglycerides are comprised of two types of chemical building blocks. We have the glycerol molecule, and then we have three fatty acid molecules that go down in a linear fashion from the glycerol. A fatty acid is a long chain of carbon and hydrogen atoms that has a cluster of carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen at one end. Fats are triglycerides that are solid, so fats are solid at room temperature, while oils are liquid at room temperature. Okay, so the difference between fats and oils is whether they are liquid or solid at room temperature. So how do fats and oils store more chemical energy than equivalent volumes of carbohydrate? For a given volume, fats and oils contain more energy-rich carbon-hydrogen bonds than carbohydrates. Remember, the energy is stored in those carbon-hydrogen bonds. So fats and oils contain more of these energy-rich bonds than carbohydrates. So when you break down the fats and oils, they produce more energy in the form of, again, ATP than if you were to break down glucose. However, the first thing that happens is that the body converts these fats to glucose. Remember, we go from fat to glucose, right? And then we can use that to make ATP. So fats may be the premier energy storage molecules, but your body has to expend twice as much energy to burn off a pound of fat than a pound of glycogen. So obviously, you don't want to just eat all this fatty food so that you can store all this energy unless you know you are actually going to be expending much energy and not having the opportunity to eat other things in the meantime, just like the bird that we saw in the previous slide. Okay, so we have different types of fats. One type of fat is called saturated fats, and the defining feature of saturated fats is that they have single bonds between carbon atoms. So you see here, there's only one line in between all these carbon atoms. Okay, so if we look at saturated fats, you can find these fats in animals and in the animal food that you eat. So a carbon atom has space to form 4 chemical bonds with other atoms. We talked about that because carbon has 4 available spaces, right, for its valence electron. So it's able to make those bonds with 4 other atoms. A saturated fat is made up of fatty acid chains with single bonds between each carbon atom. So this, for example, it could be this carbon can be linked to another carbon, right? And then linked to another carbon here. However, the other 2 spaces can be occupied by, for example, hydrogens. Because all the remaining spaces are filled, right? We have all of them filled with hydrogen atoms, the fat is said to be saturated. This arrangement makes for very long, straight fatty acid chains, which can then be packed very easily. So we can pack them in long chains and pack them in very closely. Because they're packed in very closely, this can cause saturated fats to build up in places such as arteries, which could be a potential reason why people develop heart disease. Unsaturated fats are different because they have double bonds between carbon atoms. So these unsaturated fats are found mainly in plant products and have double bonds between these carbon atoms like we saw up here. Because these double bonds take up 2 available spaces, there's only one hydrogen atom that's available. So if you remember in the previous slide, we saw that we had carbon atoms, right? So if we're looking at this carbon right here, it can be attached to 2 other carbons, right? And then it can have 2 other hydrogens as well. But if there's a double bond, the double bond takes up 2 additional spaces. So you could say that this carbon is double bonded to another one and then single bonded to another one. So we have 1, 2, 3 spaces already taken up. So there's only one hydrogen atom available in an unsaturated fat. Because hydrogen atoms do not fill all the available spaces, these fats are considered unsaturated. Double bonds produce bends and kinks, so they look more, they are not straight, they have kinks in them. It prevents them from stacking on top of each other as smoothly as the saturated fats. And because of their lack of ability to pack together, unsaturated fats build up less slowly in blood vessels and are easier to break down as well. Saturated fats, such as animal fats, tend to be solid at room temperature, whereas unsaturated fats, such as corn oil and olive oil, are usually liquid at room temperature. Okay, and we also have this other concept called hydrogenation. If you know what shortening is, it's a solid form of vegetable oil, and it's formed by hydrogenation, which basically adds hydrogen atoms to the double bonded carbon in an unsaturated fat. So that process basically smooths out all of the unsaturated fats, allowing the fat molecules to actually pack in very closely. And because it's able to pack in very closely, it's able to form a solid. So solidified vegetable oils are also called trans fat, and they are less healthy than their liquid counterparts. Okay, another type of lipid are phospholipids. And phospholipids' main defining characteristic is that they form cellular membranes. The tenebrianid beetle lives in the Namib Desert, one of the driest places on Earth. Like all living organisms, this beetle depends on chemical reactions that take place in water solution. So even though this beetle lives in a very dry environment, that doesn't change the fact that it needs water inside of its cells in order to stay alive. So how do organisms like this beetle maintain the aqueous environment? Again, aqueous means watery. So all organisms are composed of structures called cells, and that includes this beetle. And that cell maintains a constant internal environment inside the organism, no matter what the external environment is. So the cell is really essential in order to maintain that balance or homeostasis. So how do cells maintain a specific internal environment when the external environment might be changing? So the outer membrane of a cell is comprised of a dual layer, so that's two layers of lipids called phospholipids. So we have two layers of phospholipids that make up the cell membrane. The structure of this layer helps the cell maintain a constant internal environment, which again is that one of the key requirements for homeostasis. And we'll go ahead and take a closer look at what this looks like. So the phospholipid bilayer, again bi meaning two, forms the cell membrane, which you can see right here. So a phospholipid is very similar to a fat because it contains fatty acid chains and a glycerol. The difference is that a phospholipid actually only contains two fatty acid chains instead of the three that a fat has. A phospholipid also includes a phosphate group, which is unique to phospholipids. The phosphate group gives one end of the phospholipid a negative electrical charge. And we know that fats are neutral in charge, so this is unique as well. So because it is charged because of the phosphate group, the end of the chain is what we're going to call hydrophilic, which means that it attracts water molecules. So the fatty acid chain, like we learned earlier, is nonpolar and actually repels water, whereas the head of these phospholipids are polar and actually are attracted by water. So we have kind of opposite characteristics on the phospholipid. So when these phospholipids are in a watery environment, the phospholipids actually arrange themselves so that the fatty acid chains, which remember hate water, they point inward towards each other. So you see here, this is a tail, And this is another tail. They're pointing towards each other. And the reason why is because we have water on the outside of the cell, and we also have water inside of the cell, right? So these tails that hate water do not want to interact with water, so they point inward towards each other. The phosphate groups are on the outside here, and the phosphate groups again give the head a slight negative charge, right? And because it has a slight negative charge, it's attracted to water. So they're going to be pointing out towards the aqueous environment, which will be inside the cell and outside the cell. So the interaction creates two layers of phospholipids, which we call the bilayer. The phospholipid bilayer makes up the outer membrane of all the cells in your body. Because of its unique structure and chemical properties, the phospholipid bilayer can contain a separate internal aqueous environment relative to the outside. So this environment on the inside could be different from the outside as well. Okay, another type of lipid are steroids, and steroids are lipids that include carbon rings. So you see here, all of these are rings that are made up of carbon. So when male and female chimpanzee embryos first begin to develop, they look identical. However, after a few weeks of development, male embryos begin to produce a molecule called testosterone. And this testosterone is a molecule that directs the development of male reproductive organs, which makes males and females now anatomically unique. Female embryos do not produce this molecule, therefore they develop differently than the male embryos. So testosterone is one type of steroid, and steroids are a class of lipids that contain ring structures like we see in these two pictures right here of cholesterol and testosterone. One steroid that you might have heard of is cholesterol. Usually people talk about cholesterol and how bad it is for your health. However, cholesterol is actually very important in many cellular structures. Your body also uses cholesterol to make other steroids such as testosterone and estrogen. So it's not always a bad thing. Steroids are really unique as well because steroid hormones can be used as chemical messengers in the body. So have you ever gone through a stressful time? I'm sure everyone has. And sometimes at the end of your stress or during the period of time that you're stressed out, you end up with some sort of illness or cold. And that's no coincidence, actually. Your body produces a steroid hormone called cortisol when you are really stressed out. And one of the effects of cortisol is that it inhibits your immune system. So your immune system stops working as efficiently. Okay, so this makes you more likely to get sick when you're stressed out. So like other hormones, cortisol is a chemical messenger in your body. It carries information from one part of your body to another. Testosterone and estrogen, which direct your body's development into adulthood during puberty, are also steroid hormones. They are produced in the reproductive organs, but they travel and make changes throughout your body. A study of stress responses in rats shows that if rats cannot turn off their cortisol stress response, they end up developing some of the same problems that stressed out people have, such as ulcers and greater susceptibility to disease, which again is because of that decreased immune system. All right, the last type of lipid that we're going to talk about are waxes. And waxes are interesting because they're unique, and most important function is that they repel water. It's very simple. So lots of plants that live in drier areas are covered in waxes, and the reason why is because like all living organisms, these plants require water to survive, yet they live in a dry place. So how exactly are they able to retain the water and keep the water from evaporating into the atmosphere? What they do is they actually cover their leaves in a water-repelling substance that keeps water from getting to the surface of the leaves where it might actually evaporate to the atmosphere. So the waxes provides a barrier to prevent water from escaping from the plant. Wax is a type of wax is a type of lipid made of extremely long chains of fatty acids linked to an alcohol molecule. The fatty acids in waxes are saturated, meaning that they're going to pack well together like those saturated fats. Fatty acid chains are also nonpolar, so they do not attract water, which makes waxes hydrophobic or water repellent. Okay, so here is a summary of what we went over today. We went over different characteristics of lipids, mainly that it is hydrophobic, that they're made up of hydrogen as well as carbon, and then some examples we went over were fats, oils, phospholipids, steroids, and waxes. Here's some important vocabulary that you need to know. You need to know what a lipid is, a hydrocarbon, what hydrophobic means. Remember, hydro meaning water, phobic meaning fear of or hating. Triglycerides, we have fatty acids. We went over phospholipids. Remember that it's a type of lipid that also has that phosphate group. We went over what hydrophilic means, which is the opposite of hydrophobic. Went over phospholipid bilayer, which makes up the membranes of a cell. And then we also went over steroids, which are lipid molecules that are hormones, right, that can be used as chemical messengers. Or they can be structural elements in cell membranes.